Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Seneca Lake Mysteries, the podcast exploring the unusual, strange, and unexplained on New York's largest Finger Lake. Thanks as always for listening, and if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the podcast and be sure to visit SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe on the website as well so you don't miss any news or updates. Now this episode is going to be comparatively short and sweet. I've got 3 old-timey stories this time around. First up is a story of some enterprising young men who, back in 1939, built an underwater helmet breathing contraption to explore underneath the waters of Seneca Lake. Check the description of this podcast for a link to a photograph of one of the youngsters wearing this crazy helmet invention. Next up is a story about an albino trout that was pulled from Seneca Lake by some local fishermen back in 1947, 2 years before the iconic Seneca White Deer were first reported on the grounds of the Seneca Army Depot. And last up, truly one of my favorite legends surrounding Seneca Lake from back in the late 1800s. It's the strange and wild tale of a real locomotive engine that was called Locomotive 13 before given the nickname Sam Patch. I do have a soft spot for old stories of mysterious trains that were told and retold during the railway era of America, and this is a good one, so I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. And also check the description. I will be putting a photograph of this locomotive Sam Patch in a link in the description. Also, in the next week, I'll be posting some cool stuff on the website that I've been promising for a while, so make sure you're subscribed on the website so you don't miss it. And in the coming weeks, I'll be making some decisions and announcements about the future of Seneca Lake Mysteries and the podcast. Now, when I started the podcast, I really didn't have a plan on how long it would go, but honestly, I never really planned for it to run indefinitely. And as I mentioned in probably episode 1, I've been working on a book entitled Seneca Lake Mysteries, covering the kinds of stories you've heard on the podcast, plus a lot more. And recently I've been putting more of my energy into finally completing the book, which does end up taking some of my focus away from the podcast. So right now I'm really not sure what I'll do, whether I'll put the podcast on hiatus or if I'll continue the podcast 3 times a month as usual or whatever. There are still lots of stories I want to cover on the podcasts and guests I want to speak with as well, but there's also the fact that I don't want to tell all the stories from the book on the podcast. So I'm still sorting it out and working to feel out what my next steps will be. But in the meantime, the podcast is still here, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you who've been listening and supporting Seneca Lake Mysteries. So stay tuned as the Seneca Lake Mysteries project evolves and expands, and keep sharing and sending your feedback and leaving reviews and likes and comments. I appreciate it all. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this next story is another wild one. I love it. It's from the Elmira, New York Star-Gazette. It was published on July 21st, 1939. And it's a story of 3 youths from Elmira, New York, who were very curious about the Seneca drums phenomenon, the Seneca Lake serpent, and the fact that Seneca Lake had this abundant supply of lake trout. And even, to this day, Geneva claims the title, the lake trout capital of the world. So this was back in July of 1939, and this enterprising trio of young men went to some pretty crazy lengths to explore the lake firsthand. So Dan Lewis, Bob Maloney, and Charlie Scholes constructed a 70-pound diving helmet so they could get a better look underneath the surface of Seneca Lake. Now, the top of the helmet was made from a salvaged metal water heater. 2 large iron rings, a pane of glass, a significant amount of lead, 2 pieces of garden hose for shoulder padding, a bicycle pump, and a 35-foot length of rubber tubing. So the boys put together this contraption, took it over to Fir Tree Point, which is near Rock Stream on the west shore of Seneca Lake, and took it for a test run. So the way it worked, one of the young men was stationed on shore, and his job was to use the bicycle pump and pump a continuous supply of fresh air to his pal who was wearing this diving helmet. So this kid would put this lead and iron weighted rig over his head, resting the full weight of it, over 70 pounds, about the weight of a small couch, onto his shoulders. And then he would hold on to it. They had a guide rope. He would hold on to a guide rope and then wade into the water until it got deeper and deeper. And he would go in to where it was generally around 10 feet in depth. And while underwater, they discovered that bubbles of air would violently release from the bottom of the helmet, and the lake water would fill the lower portion of this giant, heavy helmet contraption, which would reach the middle of the kid's neck. So they quickly realized that the window in the helmet would get steamed up, which would prevent him from seeing clearly the underwater world of Seneca Lake. So to defog the glass, the kid wearing the helmet would simply take in a mouthful of lake water and spew it onto the glass. So he's underwater with the water up to his neck and looking out through this glass helmet. It was actually, it looks like it was Dan Lewis was the kid who was underwater, and he talked about how the underwater scenes would be magnified when he saw them through the helmet's window, and gave him a very clear view of everything in Seneca's depths. And I also need to mention that this young man clearly had little or no fear of drowning, as he agreed to put this giant helmet on his head and climb into the lake while the helmet filled with water. So it looked like this whole helmet contraption worked. So these boys were not only motivated to do this themselves, but they also spoke to the reporter about plans to create their own company and manufacture this diving system for others. They claimed at the time they had set up some tentative deals with buyers, but then they discovered that it wasn't easy to salvage a lot of these metal water heater tops, which were very scarce. So while they said they could easily produce more of the helmets in a short amount of time, they said they could only do that if the buyers would supply their own water heaters. So, and Dan, Bob, and Charlie even had a potential name for their underwater breathing helmet manufacturing business, which would have been Peekaboo Diving Corporation. Now, unfortunately, this brave young trio never solved the mysteries of the lake serpent or the Seneca drums, and they weren't able to map out the lake trout hotspots around the lake, but at least none of them drowned. So if you're a listener of this podcast, you know about the Seneca White Deer, which live at the Seneca Army Depot, that were discovered in 1949 living on the base. But there's another story about another very unusual white animal that was found in Seneca Lake 2 years prior to the discovery, quote-unquote, discovery of the Seneca White Deer. So I'm going to go to a story from the Elmira Star-Gazette from June 25th, 1947, and the headline is Albino Trout Unique Catch from Seneca. So what happened is a gentleman named Joseph Martin was fishing off of him rods with another gentleman named Robert Bartine. They were both from Watkins Glen, and they pulled into their boat an albino trout that glistened in the June sunlight. And the article goes on to say that Martin's catch was regarded as very unique in the history of Seneca Lake for as long as anyone could remember, that no one had ever caught a pure white trout in Seneca Lake. It goes on to explain that the fish, at first glance, is pure white with pink eyes, but if you look closer at it, it had gills and scales that were pure silver. The fish was 3.5 pounds and 22 inches long, and Mr. Martin and Mr. Bartine said that when they pulled it into the boat, they were both so startled that they nearly fell out of the boat. Now, here's what's interesting from there. That albino trout was put on exhibition in Watkins Glen. And according to the article, hundreds of people, including many tourists and area farmers, came by to view this strange specimen. And of course, in most cases where someone finds an anomalous animal, people will put forth theories as to where the animal came from. So in this article, it says that the theory at the time was that there were some eggs gathered by the New York State Department of Conservation hatching grounds. They had a hatching grounds off of Peach Orchard Point on the East Seneca Lake shore. And among these eggs that they gathered, 400 silver fingerlings were born. And they said that these fingerlings unfortunately became the prey of fish hawks, which would make sense because they were certainly brighter and whiter and easier for a hawk to spot from up on high. And out of those 400 silver fingerlings, almost all of them were eaten by fish hawks except for 40 of them. And supposedly those 40 pure silver baby albino lake trout were taken and placed in 1942 in the Seneca Lake outlet. And the article also notes that no reports of a white trout being caught in Seneca Lake were known, and that this was the first and only time that an albino trout was taken from Seneca Lake. Now, I did a little bit of further research, and I couldn't find any other articles or stories or mentions of this exhibition that took place of the albino trout, where hundreds of people came by to look at it. And of course, at this point, it's 78 years ago. But still, if there's anyone out there who knows about this, who has heard about this story, who knows about this exhibition of the white trout, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know. And if anyone out there has ever seen one of these albino trout in the lake or any other strange white animals around the Seneca Lake area, drop me a line and let me know as well. So I know I often say this is one of my favorite stories, but this really is one of my favorite stories. It's going to be an old-time one. We're going to go back to the late 1800s. It's one of the more colorful tales in Seneca Lake history, and it's about a locomotive named locomotive number 13. But that locomotive also had another nickname, which we'll get to in a little bit. It had a long, weird history of strange coincidences, odd accidents, leading some people of the time to believe that it was either cursed or that the locomotive somehow had a mind of its own. So let's go back to 1873. The Fallbrook Coal Company, which mined coal and operated a railroad between Blossburg, Pennsylvania and Watkins Glen, ordered a new freight locomotive, which was delivered to them from eastern New York State at the Schenectady Locomotive Works. It was the 13th locomotive placed into service by the Fallbrook Railway, so it was originally known as simply number 13. But then on August 6th, 1873, number 13 became something more than just your average freight train after it was baptized in the waters of Seneca Lake. So locomotive number 13 was working along the shore of Watkins Glen on a double-track coal trestle facing the lake. Now, a coal trestle is, railroad tracks that sort of look like a ramp that they would move cars full of coal onto canal boats, which would then transport the coal to points north and beyond. So number 13 was moving coal cars and attempted to change tracks when it was violently bumped by some other coal cars that had rolled down the slope on one end of the trestle. So the impact caused the locomotive's throttle to become stuck in the open position. And the engineer panicked. The engineer, whose name was M.S. Stratton, panicked and jumped out of the cab. So now this massive steel machine lunged up the trestle at about 30 miles an hour, crashed through a timber barrier at the end of the trestle, and launched into the air about 40 feet above the lake. The engine astonished the onlookers by sailing over 2 canal boats before it plunged into Seneca Lake, an estimated 80 feet from the end of the trestle. So for weeks, an effort was made to raise the locomotive from the bottom of the lake, where it had not only settled on the lake bottom, there's about 50 feet of water, but it also became lodged in about 15 feet of mud or quicksand, whatever you want to call it. But finally, they managed to pull the locomotive out, which weighed probably around 50 tons. They pulled it out of the water, they fully restored it, and it was put back in service on December 18th, 1873. But the locomotive also had a new nickname, which was Sam Patch. Now, it was named after a man who was widely renowned in the 19th century. He was also known as the Jersey Jumper, the Daring Yankee, and the Yankee Leaper. He was born in 1799. He was raised in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and made a name for himself as America's first famous daredevil after he jumped from a platform into the Niagara River at the base of Niagara Falls in 1829. So for that era, he was the Evel Knievel or the Johnny Knoxville. So Sam Patch became a household name over his career, which lasted about 10 years. He completed numerous dangerous high jumps all over the Northeast, off of factory walls, bridges, the masts of ships, and raised platforms above water. But on Friday, the 13th of November, 1829, Sam Patch would meet his demise only at age 30, after he jumped 125 feet into the Genesee River at High Falls, right up in Rochester, New York. So now back to Sam Patch, the locomotive. Just a few weeks after, a month or so after being placed back in action, Sam Patch, the locomotive, jumped the track in Tioga, Pennsylvania. It crashed through the train station, knocking the building 2 feet off of its foundation, and also interrupted a prayer meeting that was going on in the building, terrifying all the attendees. Several of the cars being pulled by Locomotive 13 were wrecked, and one crew member, who was the boiler operator on the engine, suffered a broken leg. But interestingly, Sam Patch came to a halt on the shore of the Tioga River, which prompted some people to say that the locomotive was just trying to find its way back to the water once again. Now, originally, Sam Patch was a broad gauge train, meaning it could only fit on tracks between Corning, New York and Horseheads, New York, transporting lumber, coal, and other products. But in 1879, it was taken into the shop and altered to become a standard gauge train. Sam Patch was in the shop for 13 days and then was put back into service on the 13th of the month. Then, a year later, in 1880, Sam Patch did it again. This time, the engine managed to find its way into the water for the second time, jumping the rails at the Seneca Lake outlet in Geneva and plunging into the Seneca Canal. So, yet another recovery effort was made. They pulled Sam Patch out of the water, dried off, cleaned up, repaired, and was put back on the tracks. And then, in that same year, Sam Patch was pulling duty as a second header of a train in Post Creek, New York, which is north of Corning. And true to form, Sam Patch jumped the track again, rumbling over the railroad ties, careening down an embankment, and becoming half buried in a swampy area of an adjacent field, once again making its way towards the water. After being pulled from the swamp and fixed up again, overhauled again, they decided to forge and mount a large horseshoe over where the pilot would sit in the engine. And for a while, it seemed like Sam Patch's propensity for jumping the rails had come to an end, but turns out the old locomotive had one more adventure in it, and some years later, Sam Patch was passing through Dresden along Seneca Lake's western shore when, to the surprise of probably no one, it left the track again, barreled through a cemetery, and knocked over several tombstones for good measure. And it's interesting to note that that cemetery is still there in Dresden. It's not super close to Seneca Lake, but the direction that Sam Patch was going when it rumbled through the cemetery was in the direction of Seneca Lake once again. So, due to its legendary history of soaring into Seneca Lake, jumping the tracks, destroying a train station, interrupting a prayer meeting, breaking a man's leg, wrecking a cemetery, and having a proclivity for freshwater, Sam Patch was finally delegated to yard switching duty in its final years of service. But some folks believed that after its Seneca Lake baptism, Sam Patch was either cursed or perhaps trying to find religion. But in any case, the weird, wild legend of Sam Patch endures to this day. Well, that's it for this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any thoughts on any of the topics in this episode, please let me know. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss anything. A new podcast comes out every month on the 7s. I'll talk to you then.